Perfect. Okay, beautiful. So what we're chatting about today, from Artboard to the live website, a creative process for web design. I am Grace Walker, as Kyle and Rachel just introduced me. I'm an independent designer and Webflow developer based in Calgary, Canada. I have been designing for 6 years and freelancing for the last 3. I worked at a studio the first 3 years of my career. Touched everything, absolutely loved it, and that was kind of the impetus for me to go out on my own. So in combination, studio work, freelance work, over the last 6 years, I've helped launch 90 marketing websites, both design and build. So I have spent my fair share of time around web work, and I hopefully have a lot to share today. So I'm really excited today also because I'm going to be using one of my client sites for Guerin Santos Engineering as an example for a lot of my points that I'm going to be talking through today. My client Craig was wonderful enough to allow me to share all of our process work. So if you have any questions as we're going through things, I'm more than happy to share kind of the behind the scenes look at things. I'll give you some sneak peeks into some stuff, but just a little call out there. So what we're going to be talking about today is process. First, we'll kind of dive into why process is important, and then go through my creative process to get from Artboard to live website in Webflow. It's about 9 steps. This is usually what it looks like when I tell my clients about it. When I'm presenting to a client, either in a proposal or kind of an initial intro call, I'm usually breaking out my process, making it nice and tidy, very step by step, but in reality, it doesn't often look as neat and tidy as it is here. But I do find it's really helpful for clients to understand my process in this kind of general framework of plan, build, and launch. Within each of these steps, I usually go over kind of the recap or like 2-second summary of what's going on here. But in general, that process is really important for me because I think that folks who are maybe new to design or aren't designers themselves, when asked about creative process or how do you come up with designs, I think sometimes inspiration also often gets brought up in that conversation. Oh, you must need to be inspired in order to do creative work on the daily. And I find that that's often really not true. Inspiration is absolutely wonderful and beautiful and magic, but that magic isn't always available to us. And so if we're able to create systems and frameworks for ourselves to be creative on a daily basis, to know that we can consistently produce successful work, no matter if we feel that magic inspiration or not, I feel like that's a really wonderful thing to build for ourselves. I really love this quote from probably my favorite piece of content on the internet, An Invocation for Beginnings by Zay Frank. And he talks about courage and let me remember that my courage is a wild dog. It won't just come when I call it. I have to chase it down and hold on as tight as I can. And I feel like creativity is often very much like that, and that kind of inspiration that we're chasing after. It's not something that just, oh, you sit down at your desk and you're ready to create creative work. Sometimes it's something that you really have to chase after and set yourself up for. So going through the creative process of how I get from a blank artboard to a web design or a living website doesn't actually start with any kind of design work at all. It really starts with a conversation. So we're going to go through all 9 of those steps from kickoff to launch and what goes into each of them. And we'll be talking about Guerin Santos as an example. So that first step in that creative process is the kickoff. This is not design work. This is simply a conversation. I call this my kickoff meeting. Other people call it discovery phase, but essentially it is the project start. A kickoff is really the first step in any project to really make sure that I understand what the client is looking for, what our goals for the site are, what success looks like. And I think that oftentimes we end up reviewing very specific questions, but I also want to leave room for organic conversation to talk about their goals, related elements, things like that. Technically or like functionally what this looks like is usually I have an hour meeting with my client All of the key stakeholders are involved. And a few weeks ahead of that meeting, I'm usually sending them a document that looks like this in a Google document or Word doc or something else that is questions for them to review ahead of time. I find that it's really helpful to send questions a few weeks ahead or a few days ahead of when you're going to be having that meeting so that your client can get a sense of what types of questions you're going to be asking. I never ask my clients to fully fill this out, but I find that my best clients often do and will make kind of like point form notes or short thoughts and things like that. So I think it's a really helpful piece within that kickoff meeting to really have as a document. What I love about this is that you can ask someone questions, they can write their notes, but I still think it is so valuable to have that conversation with someone directly on a call because things come out of the woodwork that you weren't really expecting. You can ask follow-up questions, you can dig deeper, particularly with Garen Santos. One thing that I wasn't expecting when we had our kickoff conversation was that one of their main goals for the website was to attract employees. And that was not something that had even crossed my radar. I was thinking this was a totally client-focused website for them to validate their experience, showcase their projects, things like that. But out of that kickoff call and out of the conversation part of that kickoff call came this goal of really becoming desirable to engineers who are looking for work, particularly young engineers. So really something that's key within this stage is that kind of dual approach of notes, but also talking things through. Once the kickoff call has happened, we've aligned on our expectations, we've talked through key goals and metrics for the site. My next step for creating a website is a sitemap. So we're still not at any visual design. This is still very much content planning and architecture. Within the sitemap design phase, I really want to outline all of the pages on the site, the content that's going to live on them, how they relate to one another. And how this comes about is really distilling all the information that we've talked about in our kickoff call, going off of their current site and any marketing materials that they already have, looking at their competitors, doing my own research, and kind of tying that all together with my best recommendation. What a sitemap can actually look like can be very different based on what you're doing. So we'll kind of dive into some functional examples here with a sitemap design. These are the two on the left are the same, they're just different formats. And then this one on the right I'll get into. So what I actually presented to GSEI when we were doing our sitemap was this. At a glance, we've got kind of our homepage and common elements up at the top, and then all of our unique pages below. I've also shown it here. I'll kind of zoom in on this in a second. This sitemap was done in January of 2022, so it is a little bit of an outdated format for me. I've since moved on to this other kind of format that's a little bit more color-coded, but they're both like very functionally the same. I think what's important about a sitemap design in general is that you're mapping out the unique pages that are going to live on the site, what lives on those pages, and if there's any sub-pages and how they relate to the main navigation. A sitemap is really a great opportunity to lay out the entire website as a guide, and it can oftentimes bring up discussion points that you weren't expecting about how a company speaks about their services or organizes their products. And I find that this is a really essential step before we get into visual design to make sure that the categories that we're talking about have some thought behind them. We have a chance to have discussion about project pages versus services and how we're organizing things in a hierarchy. So changes at this point in time when we're looking at a sitemap in Figma that's essentially a diagram are really, really easy and quick for us to go through versus once we get into visual design, it can be more tedious and more difficult to like fully change our tune. So this is a very quick way for us to map out the entire site as a guide. So this second kind of version of the sitemap is closer to what I am delivering most of the time right now. It's really just like a color-coded diagram of the website. So we have our primary pages in that light lilac, secondary pages in a light gray, admin in the dark gray, and then links in the bright purple. So really each of these, we have our homepage up at the top, main navigation for each page, and then any subpages live below there, and then just our footer navigation. So trying to lay out all of those elements all at once. Something that I've also been playing around with recently in the sitemap phase of projects is doing this kind of combination sitemap wireframe. And I saw John Saunders talk about this in his Webflow conference talk from last year. If you go to YouTube and look up John Saunders Webflow conf, I'm sure his talk will come up, but it was really excellent. And it was his entire talk was about building sitemaps and how important they are. And he had kind of put together this combination wireframe sitemap that I thought was really wonderful. And so I've been incorporating this into more of my projects when it is a more robust project, or if a client is having trouble visualizing what this kind of looks like in practice. So it really is just translating that very basic sitemap into this more kind of blocked out, also very basic wireframe that can give someone a better idea of kind of the cadence of the page and things like that. Overall, just recap on sitemap, we really want to make sure that we're making choices about structure in a really malleable environment before we get into visual design, because this acts as our kind of source of truth for structure as we go forward with the project. The next step that I get into after sitemap design is mood boarding and reference. And this isn't something that I included in that kind of initial project workflow that I share with clients. It's really something that's for myself. I know that this isn't necessarily how everyone approaches mood boards, particularly if you're a brand designer, you're probably going to be sharing mood boards with clients or sharing more discovery or things like that. I've moved away from doing pure brand work. I'm really just doing web design and development at this point. The GSE project that I'll use as an example here was a brand refresh and web design project. So there was a little bit of new creative work that was happening. But I find mood boards really helpful, not necessarily to act as something that I'm going to copy. I never want to fully use a reference and then kind of rip that and recycle it into my own work. That's never my intention. Mood boards and visual reference are really for me to gather visual language that's being used and try to make associations with that. Every visual thing that exists has meaning tied to it, whether that is associations around values or actions or historical associations. And when we can make really intentional associations based on the visual language that we're using, that's when we can really start communicating not only through the copy on our website, but also through the visuals. So what that looks like in practice, I used to do very pretty mood boards that I would share with my clients, but now they're messy and they're really just for me. So most of the time what my mood boards look like is really just a collection of images that are inspiration for layout, for kind of visual applications, for exploration on how I want to explore color and typography and things like that. Oftentimes when I'm working with a company like GSEI, our values that we're trying to express about the company have been solidified after our kickoff conversation. We know what we're trying to say about them as a company. In this case, they're very precise. They're technically capable. They only focus on industrial clients. So what we're saying is really the same no matter which direction we're going with. So what I'm trying to do with mood boards is really try to start pulling apart a visual direction in how we can express precision in two different ways, how we can express that industrial component in two different ways, which kind of brings me to the next stage of my development for custom websites is design directions. When I'm designing a custom website from scratch, I'm usually doing two distinct design options presented in homepage designs. This is how I really like to work with clients, particularly if they are coming to me perhaps with just like a logo and a color palette. That was the case with GSEI. They had this really beautiful structured logo that they had been using for decades. And then as they entered this new phase of their business, they wanted to refresh everything. So we wanted to keep it like grounded in the historical aspects of the company because it had been around for decades, but we wanted to modernize it. So taking those mood boards that we had, everything that I knew about from our kickoff conversations, the inspiration that they had sent me, all of that, I put together into 2 distinct design options. Like I mentioned with the mood boards, at this stage, I'm really trying to pull apart values into 2 different expressions. So we'll go through these in a second, and then we can chat about them further. So when I'm working on initial designs, I'm kind of like, I have a working file where I have other references pulled, I'm getting into design, but what I presented to the client were these 2 homepage design directions. And so right off the bat, we can see a lot of similarities between the 2 of them. We're using like a blue palette. We've got blue and red on the left, a very bright blue on the right. A sans serif that feels very structural. But as we get into each of them, I'm trying to pull them apart further from one another to really, like I said, take those values, express them in multiple ways so that the client can start having an opinion on what they like, what they don't like, how they want to see their projects displayed, things like that. So this first option was very rooted in their kind of original logo that they had, which was set in Helvetica. We went with a very grotesque typeface, very structured layout. We're introducing this grid pattern in the background that they had been using, and kind of a lot of their legacy material, and putting that together in something that felt very, very corporate, very structured, very structural engineering. This was really close to kind of where their current state was, and they had expressed that they wanted to feel more contemporary than their current expression. So for the second option, I tried to take this into much more of a modern direction. Feels very light, airy. We've punched up that blue a little bit lighter and also more saturated, and tried to pair it with a more contemporary geometric sans serif face that just felt a little bit more modern. So this option in general, while it has a lot of similarities to the first option, it's very structured, it feels very technical, trying to express that in slightly different ways so that we can see that throughout the site. So when I present these design directions, oftentimes, I would say almost always, we end up combining things from each direction. I think it's really important at the beginning of a project to give a client options for how things can be expressed, try to pull things apart so that they can start to form opinions, like I said. And then once those opinions form, we can pick elements from each that we really like and that feel the most authentic to their brand. I think this really sets the foundation for the rest of the site design when we get into all of the unique pages, because we are making choices based on what they really enjoyed from each of those 2 options. So once I've presented these 2 homepage directions, in actuality with this project, they really liked option 2, but there was a few pieces of it that they weren't totally on board with. So I went back and did a couple of variations on that option. So here I have 2A, 2B, 2C, and these were kind of an interim step where I wasn't totally sure that I wanted to go forward with the full unique design based on the feedback that they had given. So I sent them another round in between for us to make some other choices. So this was around color palette, typography, how we're showing projects, things like that. So this middle step of starting to integrate some of their thoughts from the first option into the second was really helpful in that conversation. As we got into the full website design is where things really started to shape up into what you would expect of a full custom marketing website. My goals in the full website design are to really build out everything based on the sitemap. That's really where this comes back to our planning stage, is when we can have all of our unique pages built out. as I'm designing these out, I'm really just going back to reference the sitemap that I've built to see what needs to be on that page. And that acts as a really nice starting point when I'm trying to figure out what the heck goes on an expertise page if we're a structural engineering company. So I'm going back to that sitemap to reference the things that we've discussed that need to be there, and figuring out ways to lay them out and showcase them within the structure that we've built. Also with that, as we're getting into unique page designs, I'm trying to pull elements that we've started to use conventionally on the homepage and express those in different ways on the subpages. So for example, on the homepage here, we've started using this like little notch piece as a frame. That was a legacy part of their previous brand. So I was trying to figure out how we could incorporate that into our secondary pages. And ended up reversing it into the light blue, also kind of visually signaling that we're in the interior of the website because we're using it in reverse. So with that, we've got all the unique pages designed. Everything is kind of built out within Figma. And our next big step that we've kind of already talked about throughout the project as well is design revisions. And I've pulled out design revisions separate from development revisions because I think that they serve a very different purpose. When I'm asking for feedback in the design phase, I want to have conversations about big choices. I think when I'm designing a website, I want all of our messy choices to be happening in Figma. All of our choices around layout, how we're expressing structure, if we're changing up how case studies are done. I want all of those decisions to happen in Figma because they're much easier to make in a static environment than they are once you get into development. So what that looks like for design revisions is often a combination of comments and conversations. I invite my clients into my Figma file from the start of a project so that they can see how I'm working on things. They can make comments. We have a weekly sync typically. So every week during the project, we'll get together and have conversations about feedback, how they're enjoying certain elements or iterations of certain things throughout the project. And I use that in combination with commenting features as well so that they can feel free to add comments about small specific things. And then we have time and space and opportunity to have larger conversations about structural issues. Like I said, make all big decisions in Figma before moving into Webflow. We'll talk about that more once we get into development revisions. Once all of our design is tied up with GSEI, this ended up into 4 rounds of design. So we had our initial design directions, kind of middle piece to figure out some more of the conventions, the full site design first pass, and then the full site design second pass. So the second pass of the full site design added a lot more detail. I resolved some of the issues on, for example, like the about page, how we were talking about their process, their team, how some interactions and animations were going to look over time. And at this stage, I really wanted to, like I said, make sure all of the kind of small pieces were tied up in Figma and we were ready to get into development. I used to start from my own template, building in Webflow, and now I use Mast from No-Code Supply Co. So when I was building, sorry.
I have more questions on that because we, Mast was the topic that we talked about in the previous meetup. And yeah, so we got our first celebrity brand ambassador here with us today.
Yeah, I love Mast. I like could talk about it all day, but this site was built more than a year ago in February of 2022. So at that point in time, I was just starting from my own project starter. I was not using Client First or any other framework at that point in time, very intentionally. I really liked the framework that I had. We'll talk about Mast in a second. I love it. It like completely transformed how I build sites. But when I did build this, I think my intention is still the same. I wanted this to be as efficient as possible, and that's why I want to make decisions that are more messy in Figma, so that when we get into Webflow, we're very efficient. We're making the most minimal choices when it comes to class naming, when it comes to class structure, when it comes to styling, so that we can make sure that everything is going to be as performant as possible. When I get into Webflow, most of the builds that I do take between like 15 to 25 hours of time before I want to send it to the client. I really want to make sure that a site is as finished as possible before I send it to a client to review, so that all of our energy is spent on really meaningful changes and revisions and things like that. So once I build in Webflow, I've set up all of our CMS collections. I have all of our projects input, everything like that. We get into our next stage, which is development revisions. We had just chatted about design revisions and how that was more conversational and big choices, things like that. But when I am in development, the revisions that I'm doing are oftentimes a lot more pragmatic. It's things like, oh, this button doesn't work, or this alignment is off, or things like that. And I try to catch everything as well as possible before I send it to client. But I find in general, feedback in development is like small functionality things. My preferred way to collect feedback when we are in development is with tools like Markup. Markup is my tool of choice. I know that there's lots of others that do like very similar things, but essentially it allows you to comment on specific elements. They're tied to not only that point in the page, but also the viewport. So you can make comments on desktop, on tablet, on mobile. I unfortunately deleted the actual markup space for GSCI when I was doing some cleanup a few weeks ago. But it worked really well. You can have like conversations in the comments. So if your client makes a comment about a headline and someone else wants to provide feedback for that, it's a really nice collaborative environment. I think something important to note within development revisions, while I've been talking about making all of our messy choices in Figma, is that even though I really, really, really want the design to be approved and solid before we move into development, I know that there will always be things that need to change once the site is built. It's all well and fine to approve something in static form, but once you're actually interacting with it and using it, I find sometimes things just need to change, whether that's based on the client's feedback, or I see something and I've built it and I'm like, oh, I actually don't like that now that it's live. So I think while I do want the site to be solid before we move into Webflow, I'm always open to changes. And I really want to make sure that whatever we're launching is the most useful site for my client. And if that means making changes once we're in development, obviously justified changes and changes that are thoughtful and correct, I'm more than open to that. So dev revisions, we're going back and forth, making comments on specifics of the site. And then we get to launch, which is probably the most exciting part of any project, is actually getting a website live. What that looks like on my end of things is once all of the revisions are made, everyone's happy with the site, we're ready to go live, I will transfer the site to my client's account. I never want to host a site within my own account. I want my clients to host their sites, only accounts that they're hosted within. Webflow's new freelancer guest feature is amazing, and it has saved me so much time from logging into clients' accounts on my own. So functionally, when we're ready to launch, I'll transfer a site to a client's account. We'll add hosting, and we'll have a 1-hour training session to go through how to add content, manage content, add revisions, things like that. My general philosophy when it comes to building sites for clients is that I really want to empower clients to manage their sites themselves. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to be there to support them for large additions and new features and new functionality. But I really want to make sure that my clients have all the tools that they need to add new blog posts or new team members or change their address. I don't need to be involved in those kind of daily small updates. So that's what the training session is for, to make sure that everyone has the tools that they need. I will often, or always actually, I always send out this PDF guide document alongside the training session that we do. It basically goes over every single piece of content that I talk about within our training session, and is kind of like the notes that they would have taken if they were to take notes. So what that looks like in the training session is we'll be on a Zoom call, we'll record the Zoom call, and I'll send them a PDF. So we have kind of like multiple resources within their arsenal to look back on if they ever need something. And I'm always open for their questions or support kind of as needed as well. Once the site launches, I also always check my work. I think especially if you're doing a project that is, most of my projects are 10 to 12 weeks long. So that's in the kind of like 2 to 3 month range. If you're working on something daily, you can miss things. And so once the site is launched and kind of even pre-launch, I really want to be checking my work. What that looks like is usually after a site is live, doing lighthouse audits to make sure that I haven't missed anything on the accessibility or SEO front, and also doing audits in SEMrush for just like a general site performance, which usually catches more kind of technical things about like missing meta descriptions, or I have duplicate title tags, or a page has low text to HTML ratio, things like that. So that's also a very important part of my launch step. And that is kind of I think I talked for more than I was supposed to, but that's a kind of a recap of my process of getting a site from a blank artboard in Figma to a fully functional site in Webflow. And a little bit about why I think process is really important, especially when you're doing creative work daily. So I'm happy to answer any questions, chat through, talk more about this project in particular, or anything else. So I hope that was helpful, and we can take a little bit from it.
I thought that was great. So round of applause for you, Grace. Fantastic. If you've ever been to one of these meetups before, you know that I end up having about 25 questions. But I want to leave it to, if anyone else has a question right off the bat that they want to ask, you can either put it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Oh, okay. Google Meet's finally delivering with all of these exciting moving emojis that you can add to the screen. Okay, cool. I'm into it.
So Mohammed is asking, how is Mast better than Client First? Grace, I don't know if have you used Client First, or did you just look into it?
Yeah, so when Client First came out, I was really interested. I really liked the idea of a framework. I had kind of been using my own framework and naming convention for like a few years at that point in time. And I looked into Client First. I really liked the naming convention, but I wasn't on board with the style convention, especially with nested divs and the way that padding is handled within sections and the page and things like that. So that was kind of my biggest sticking point, was I couldn't get on board with how many nested divs there were. It was driving me nuts. So I was like, I'm not going to use that. Which when I had a walkthrough with Corey of Mast was the thing that immediately I was like, oh, this makes sense. It was structured in a very similar way to the way that I was kind of like already doing stuff, just like better and cleaner and more efficient. And so I think it made sense from like a development standpoint. I've never used Client First in practice, so I can't like fully speak to it, but I couldn't get on board with it at the beginning.
I'd say that I've used Client First, and I agree with you. There are a lot of divs, and I was at a point where I wasn't doing freelance. I wasn't full-time freelance, so it was like things on the side, and I didn't have a framework of my own to like fall back on and say, oh yeah, I was kind of looking, I was hungry for something. And so then when someone came along and was like, name things this way, I was like, oh, okay, great. I'll just do that. But then I got into it and I was like, whoa, this is a lot of divs. And yeah. we had a big Client First talk, I don't know, it's probably a year ago. And was it Penny? Did you talk about it, Penny?
Yeah. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I basically kind of showed how it worked, the initial layout of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot of divs. It's a little bit Coke and Pepsi for Muhammad. It's probably not that one is. I mean, I've never used mass, but it's not like there's a right and a wrong answer. It's
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the really wonderful thing about development in general. Like, and I like don't really call myself a developer because I don't code. I only build in Webflow. I have to ask Corey all of my complicated questions. But I think in general, there is so many ways to build something that is right, and to build something in a way that is right for you and for your client is the most important thing. And that can be different.
So we've got a question here. I see Patty's hand is up, but we got a couple of in the chat. So you mentioned you don't do brand work. Do you have any prerequisites that the client has to have on an existing brand? Or what happens if their brand identity is outdated, or they don't have a guideline, or it's so rough? I've had clients that it's like so rough, and all you want to do is kind of refresh it a little bit. Do you have any guidelines there?
Yeah, so that's kind of where the GSDI project was, is that they had a logo and they had a color palette, but they didn't really have a brand. And my answer has kind of changed over time. So a year ago, I was doing brand work and web design work. So when a client came to me and they like maybe had a logo, or they didn't even have a logo, I've done projects in the last year that were like a full brand identity. When clients come to me with that, it's like a much different project structure. And what I was finding was that while I could do those projects, there was oftentimes, like I liked the website portion of them the best. So what I found over the first 2 years of freelancing was that all I really wanted to do was the website portion. I could do the brand portion, and I wasn't bad at it. I'm really proud of the work that I did with GSEI. I've done like a lot of other brand projects, but I started to meet folks who were just wildly talented brand designers and strategists, and just got so much deeper into it than I ever did or could. And once I was exposed to the level of brand work of some of my collaborators that I work with now, I basically was like, I'm not doing brand anymore. So my prerequisite now for like my ideal project is that a client comes to me following brand work that's been done with a partner or a collaborator. I want all of my projects to be in collaboration with a brand partner. So whether that's a studio or a brand designer, I want brand work to be happening, and then I enter the project. I break that rule. I'm working on a project right now that basically like they have a logo and it's like very similar to GSEI. And I will do that occasionally if it's like projects that I'm really interested in, the subject matter is cool, the client's a good fit, stuff like that. But almost all of my projects now are in partnership with brand designers.
Do you ever turn down clients because of their brand or lack of brand?
I will turn down clients if they, like if it's not in partnership with a brand studio, and if it's not a project that I'm like particularly interested in. Most of the qualification now for projects that I take on is whether it's a good fit for my skills, whether it has brand work involved, whether the timing is a fit, and if it's of personal interest to me. So I'm really lucky to be in a position where I get more leads than I need, and I can really filter them out based on, is a brand designer involved? Does the timing work? Am I interested in this? Is the budget good? All of that. So hopefully that answers the question, Matt.
An old boss of mine, he had this phrase, and he would say, what you eat depends on how hungry you are. And when you've got people when you've got a ton of food, you get to kind of pick and choose. But if you haven't eaten in a while, you'll all of a sudden, things look good that didn't before. And so, that's a great spot for you to be in here, is to be able to kind of have those criteria and be able to follow through with those. One more on the chat, and then we're going to go to the queue. How many, and I think you kind of answered this, so this is maybe a quick one, but how many weeks to do this whole process for the website?
Yes. So the whole process from start to finish is usually 8 to 12 weeks. I'm just going to open up a schedule here so that you can see what that looks like without, here we go, process. I'm just trying to find the neutral one that doesn't have any client names on it. Beautiful.
And excuse me for my mispronunciation, the process.
Oh, perfect. Can we see Figma file here?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is also what I include in my proposal template to clients. Alongside that process overview that I shared is usually a sample schedule. So for my standard kind of 8 to 12 page marketing site, this is usually the schedule that I'm working off of. I do have a different kind of standard schedule for development only projects, which are a whole different thing that we didn't even talk about today. But usually this is what it looks like. They're kind of color coded in coordination with that process map. So we have our plan phase, build phase, and launch phase. I usually have a kickoff meeting. We talk about our site map in week 2. Week 3 is for design directions. Week 4, we're getting into the full website design, development, etc. So this is usually the like kind of visual overview. And then when I get into a project contract, I'll specify dates more rigidly.
Love it. Let's Patty. Patty, you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Grace. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. It was super informative and for answering our questions, obviously. So I was curious, what do you think of the Figma to Webflow plugin? Because as a beginner using Webflow, I did like try it, but it didn't work. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on it.
What do you mean it didn't work? Like it just didn't pull over at all, or it was just such a mess, or?
It was a little messy. So the basic premise of the Figma to Webflow plugin was that like everything has to be auto layout. At least that's what I understood. And you copy paste it into Webflow, which is like godsend, right? But when you paste it into Webflow, it like when I pasted it into Webflow, it didn't turn out correct. So I was just curious, like what other people thought of it.
Yeah, this is so funny because Kyle asked me this exact question when we were chatting about this session, like idea wise. So I have a couple thoughts on it. I think that the way that I design in Figma is very messy. I don't label my layers. I very rarely use auto layout. I have had clients who are more versed in Figma than I am tell me that I'm a Figma noob and given me tutorials on how I should be creating buttons and things like that, which I always appreciate. But like the way I am in Figma is like incredibly messy, and I want to be messy in Figma. That's kind of the point. So I feel like if I were to use the Figma to Webflow plugin properly and have success with it, I would basically need to rebuild my file, which like I should just rebuild in Webflow at that point. So maybe in time I will adapt my workflow if like the plugin becomes something that's just like absolutely essential and amazing. I could adapt my workflow in Figma to maybe like put the first draft in or something like that. But especially using a framework like Mast, I really want to make sure that it's set up properly before I start building. So right now, I don't think that there's a way that I would ever use it in a client project. I haven't experimented with it like a whole lot, but I think that the really cool thing about it and the part that excites me the most, and this is what I told Kyle, was the signal that it sends about Webflow and their innovation as a team is that they're spending time and resources on developing new cool things. And I think that that's the most important thing about the Figma to Webflow plugin is that they're spending time playing and innovating and doing new stuff that like we haven't thought of. And that's the coolest part about it. And like, that's what I want from Webflow. I want them to be experimenting and like rapidly releasing stuff that no one had thought of. Like, that's what I want from them. And so that is the cool part, but I don't think I'm gonna use it right now.
Agreed. Okay, thank you.
Penny, fire away.
Cool. All right. So we're not talking about pricing particularly, but how much do you know when you book the project, and I know you're often booking far in advance or, sometime in advance, how much do you know about the project in order to set your price? And what happens if, when you get into discovery, you find out that there's more technical requirements than normal or than you were expecting? Does that affect your pricing, or do you just kind of set with what you originally laid out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I come at this in a few different ways. Normally in my initial calls with a client, I'm trying to ascertain how many pages the site is, if there's any unique functionality, specifically asking about, is there any unique functionality that you're anticipating in the site? Sometimes clients will say like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, does it need to integrate with HubSpot? Do you have any job boards or like ATS applicant tracking systems that need to be included? Does this need to sync with other data? And trying to get a good sense of that. I also find that a lot of my clients now are fairly well prepared. They have, like, generally the type of client that I want to be working with has a dedicated marketing person, like a marketing lead or a director of marketing in their company. So they've done a lot of front-loaded work about what is this site going to be? What does it need to include to be successful? What unique functionality is there? So those types of projects I feel like are oftentimes more well thought out and have like a more rigid scope to them. So it's easier to scope those from a pricing perspective. If I do get into a project and there's something that is like wildly outside of the functionality, if it's a little bit outside of the functionality, I'm like, okay, we could probably do that. Like, we'll just sweep it in, it's fine. If it's wildly outside of the functionality, or I'm going to need to like hire external resources in order to achieve it, if it's like something that is like a fully custom coded piece, then it's a, hey, this is outside of what we had chatted about initially with the scope. It's going to take X, Y, Z in order for us to achieve that. We could do it this way, which we couldn't do in scope, or if you want to do it this way, it'll cost X amount of dollars. So just trying to flag that early. But if on the other hand, if I've promised something that I think that I can do, and I get into the project and realize, oh no, I can't do that, that's on me, and I will eat costs on that. Typically, if it's something that like I've promised the client and I've told them that we can do it, at that point, I feel like it's my responsibility to deliver it. It doesn't happen very often that I like promise something I can't do, but it happened recently and I just ate the cost.
Paul.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. That was awesome. I want to know if you've ever had to sell Webflow to a client.
Yes, I used to.
If they come back to you and say, oh, why can't we just use Squarespace or Wix or whatever?
Yeah, good question. So I've been working with Webflow for over 6 years, and probably the first 3 of those when I was working in studio, we were selling Webflow a lot, mostly because nobody had heard of it. And so the pieces that I typically would talk about when I was selling Webflow were the ability for us to have fully custom design, but also have access to the CMS through the editor so that the client could manage their site. When I was selling Webflow as a platform, often what I would do is get on a screen share with them and show them one of my client sites that I had already built, and like go through the editor and show them how easy it was and things like that. More recently, I would say like the last 2 years of freelancing, I really have not sold Webflow at all. And that's primarily because I've made myself very visible within the Webflow community. So oftentimes, almost always when clients are reaching out, they're reaching out because they know me through Webflow. And even like GSEI, for example, the Garen Santos project that I was sharing, they had done research about what website platform they wanted to use. And they themselves had come to the conclusion that Webflow is the best option. And then they reached out to me. So I find that oftentimes if a client is doing research about what the best platform is, they're gonna, like most of the time, come back with Webflow as the answer. And if you can make yourself visible within like your area or expertise as the Webflow person, that can be really useful.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Luke.
Luke?
Is Luke still? Yeah, there you are. You moved
Oh
up.
gosh, that's me. That means I have to talk. Okay. Hi, Grace. Thanks for your presentation. That was awesome. I have maybe a non-exciting question, but I wonder how you handle compliance with your clients, like, you know, GDPR or any kind of privacy policy or any kind of like compliance things. Do you pass the costs on to them? I know there's a lot of tools out there like Termageddon or Termly or something where you can do subscriptions, or do you just, I don't know. How do you do that?
Yeah. So all of the kind of like legal aspects of a website, I leave to my clients. I will make them aware that, hey, we have a form on our website. We need to have a privacy policy. And that's usually the kind of like baseline of my interaction. More recently, a lot of the clients that I'm working with already have really robust legal policies. So I'm just integrating them into their new website. But if someone isn't aware, I will make them aware. If they are pushing and need to be GDPR compliant, usually that's a request on the client side, and I'll build out a cookie policy for them, like a modal from, like, usually I'm using the FinSuite cookie because it's the easiest, things like that. But usually when it comes to legal questions and things like that, the client owns their site. They need to be responsible for their privacy policy. I can point them in the right direction, but I do not generate that content for them.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Penny.
Back to me, always with the questions here. So I have two questions. They're somewhat related. One is, where does content fit into the process? Is that something that the client is creating, or are they having a content writer? And when do you have that? And then the second question is, when clients are looking after their sites themselves, what do you recommend to them in terms of adding photos? Like, how do they deal with not adding 10 meg photos of beautiful projects, resizing and all of that sort of thing?
Yeah, really good questions. Okay, I will talk about the content piece first, and I'm going to share my screen with a content outline. So content is the most difficult part of any website project. It is difficult for a few reasons, especially if a client has not ever generated content like this before. Writing for a website is very different than writing for a lot of other material. So typically what I'm doing is that I will try to ask a client for all of their existing marketing materials. And in the design, I will propose the structure that I would recommend based on my research, their competitors, their current site, all of that. And I will put a first draft of copy in. I always tell my clients, this is 100% placeholder. We're going to be changing it. But I find that designing with copy that is intentional is really, really helpful. And when we were looking at GSEI as an example, as I was going through my work, there was some lorem ipsum there. I try to not include lorem ipsum at all unless I know nothing about the subject matter and don't have anything to go on. So first step is trying to suggest a first draft of copy. I find that it's much easier for a client, especially if they're not working with a copywriter, to edit copy versus generate it from scratch. So if I can do the first version of the site with placeholder copy, with ChatGPT, with Copy AI, generated content, then we can get to a place where we have a content out then that looks like this, and we're really just editing at that point. This happens after the full website design while the development is happening. And so because this happens kind of simultaneously, sometimes there are changes in development once we have the final copy and we need to like add another column for another stat or like change this section or whatever, which I'm totally fine with. So generally this is a sample content outline that I have. I do this in a Google Doc. It's a collaborative environment for clients to work in. I will label everything based on their sections, the pieces of content within them, and then I'll make notes and highlight them in yellow if that's copy that I particularly need, or in pink if it's like a note that something will be CMS generated. So I find, go ahead.
You're kind of putting this, you're like giving them guidance, but you're putting this in their hands.
Yes.
And does it ever, do you find that you're actually ending up writing copy for a lot of people?
Not really. Like I'll write the first version, but I'm never really generating it from scratch. It's usually from their existing materials and kind of like reworking what they have. And then because they can see what the intention is supposed to be, they'll rewrite it themselves, like based on that. So I don't know. I never really like check if they've fully changed it or not.
No, I more meant, I'll do things like this, and it's like I'm doing something on like government contracting, and it's like I don't know anything about, and so I put in what I think, and then that I know is wrong or know is kind of bad, and then they don't ever change it, and so then they like don't come in and write the copy, or they come in and write the copy, and it's not good. I wanted 2 sentences, and they gave me like 4 paragraphs, and then so. I end up doing a lot of the copywriting.
Yeah, sometimes I will suggest, like, if a client has written something that's like way too long for the design, I will suggest something or like edit it back, which I generally feel quite comfortable doing. But yeah, I don't know that I've ever had a client just like totally like not fulfill on the copy side of things. Interesting. I'm sure that will happen. I have I do find though that like if I don't provide a content outline to a client and I just say generate the copy, they generally have no idea what to do. Yeah. And so that is why I like try to handhold as much as possible when it comes to content, because if I don't do the first step, like they'll never take the second. Not always. Like some of my clients who are like have bigger budgets or are more involved, those clients will often have copywriters, and so or I'll help them find a copywriter, and so at that point in time I'm still doing this content outline, but then the copywriter takes it and just does beautiful work with it. And so I've had really positive feedback from copywriters also using this format, that like I'll put everything into this, they know what to do, they have an outline, like they don't have to like write a content outline, and so they've really enjoyed that. And I forget your second question. Or if you follow.
Large images.
Oh, large images. So if it's within the CMS, I'm generally setting a size limit, which like I feel like most of us probably are. So if it's a CMS image, I can set a size limit on like it can't be over 400 kilobytes. If it's within a multi-image gallery within a CMS, then you can't set a max. So I will generally just add like help text, like please resize your images with like tiny PNG or whatever. For other images across the site, I think for a long time I was really bad at this, and like some like kind of still am, because I will give guidance on my clients to make sure you're downsizing your images. But once a client owns their site, I'm not checking it. Unless they're paying for monthly maintenance. So sometimes I do go in and I find a 2 megabyte image on the hero section, and that's kind of just, there's not much I can do about it besides like provide education and tell them why that's not great. But once a site is in a client's hands, it is out of mine, and I have to live with that.
So I want to dig into that more, because you hand it over, and you're like, hey, take it. Are you, and I know you do training, are you training them on the editor, or on the designer, or just the editor?
I will only train a client on the designer if they are a designer. So if I'm working with like a marketing team, for example, and they have an in-house designer, or like the marketing person is really well-versed in Webflow, I will do a walkthrough of the designer and explain the style system and how things work. Especially these are folks that like have built the first version of their website and they hired me to rebuild it. And so like they know how to use Webflow. They're just like, they want it to be good. And so that scenario, I will train them on the designer. Almost like if it's a direct client, they're not a marketing person, they're not a designer, I'm training them on the editor, and I'm telling them, if you go into the designer, you can break things. It's not a safe environment to be in. If you do have changes that are outside of the capabilities of the editor, I would recommend that you get in touch with me and we can work through those changes together.
It's like scare the bejesus out of them.
It's not a safe environment.
Yeah.
Danger.
It's like the editor is like the safe bumper environment. You can't break the site. If you go into the designer, you can, and you should be aware of that. I had a client last summer who handed their site over to an SEO team to make changes to the site, and it was like a 3-month-old site. It was very nice, and I had to end up restoring a backup and making all of their changes again because it was just so butchered, because that was kind of lost in communication, which was probably a fault on all parties. I could have better communicated that, but in that situation, I was like, we just have to go back to where it was. Like, I'm not fixing this, which is really frustrating. But I'm glad that we caught it like soon and not after someone had had it for like 6 to 8 months, and then you have a million changes to make.
When do you, and maybe the answer is always, but how do you account for accessibility? Are you doing that? Is there like a phase of your build where you're like, now I'm doing accessibility to like clean it all up? Are you like, what's your approach there?
Yeah, so I think that this is something that I'm like constantly learning about and trying to get better at and make sure that the site is as accessible as possible. Most of the time when I'm in the design phase, what I'm primarily concerned with is things like contrast and sizing and making sure that buttons are appropriate sizes and that paragraphs are readable and things like that. When I'm getting into the build, I'm always very cautious of the semantic structure of my pages to make sure that they're going to be accessible through a screen reader. So making sure that I'm labeling headings properly, that I'm setting up lists properly, that my navigation is a list, that all of my area labels are in place for things that are images that are links, particularly social links, the logo, things like that. So it's something that I think there's a lot to know. And I'm always trying to be as cautious of it as possible, and I'm constantly learning, but I'm really trying in development to make sure that things are semantically structured, have appropriate labels, have alt text, things like that. So
how much time do you think it adds to a project?
I don't know that I like think about how much it adds, because it's kind of just like part of delivering a good site.
Yep.
Or like a complete site. Oftentimes I forget my area labels. That's like the one thing that I always forget. And then I do a lighthouse check and I'm like, oh, I need to like label that link or something like that. But if anyone has like a course on or like guidance on accessibility in Webflow, I would love to see that, because like Webflow has a really good guide for accessibility that I try to follow as well. But I feel like that's something that a lot of people in the community are craving, of just like learning how to make the best possible sites that are accessible.
Mm-hmm. There was an article in our paper today that a lot more companies are being sued for ADA violations because their websites aren't accessible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's probably more sites that are like that have some utility. There's like a kind of probably an app behind it, you know, like Domino's Pizza. Domino's Pizza was the famous one that got sued because their like pizza tracker wasn't accessible and they lost. So, but yeah, it was kind of top of mind. I think, are there any we've got a couple, I mean, Grace, first off, thank you for just like letting us pepper you with questions.
Oh, absolutely.
I would like to know if there's a client you would not recommend use Webflow.
Oh, all the time. So like most of the clients who come to me have pre-qualified Webflow for themselves. So generally, like I'm not really having that conversation of Webflow's not the right choice. I used to have this conversation a lot with folks who wanted to do e-commerce. They wanted to have web app functionality. So I think there's a few things that like immediately disqualify Webflow for me, for a client, and that's e-commerce, and anything that's like a more complicated web app, like things like memberships. Like, yes, you can do them. I don't want to do them, but they can be done. Like I only want to be doing marketing sites. I don't really care for like setting up memberships or like complicated flows or like no-code apps, like things that like Connor Finlayson just excels at. Like I don't really want to do those, which is just a personal choice. There's lots of people who do them really well, but I will not recommend someone use Webflow if they want to have a really complicated, or not even complicated, but just like really performative e-commerce store. mostly because Shopify has so many integrations and extra functionality that Webflow just like isn't there yet. I think Webflow e-commerce is fine for small shops, or like if you're selling like a few digital items. Like I have a client right now who sells their annual membership. They're like a volunteer organization for product managers, and they sell their annual membership through Webflow e-commerce. And then we have a no-code, like an automation setup that like triggers a bunch of other things after that. And then the other one is like web app stuff. Like you can do really complicated things with automation and like whale sync and sync between Airtable and Webflow and like connect to a million apps. But I personally am not interested in those, and I do not want to be responsible for maintaining them long term. So those are projects that I typically turn down or say like someone else could do this, but I'm not going to, or this isn't possible within Webflow.
Do you do Webflow automations?
I will for some clients, but I don't generally want to do automation work now. Like if it's something simple like, oh, this form needs to go here, or stuff like that. But if it's like a very automation heavy project and I know that from the outset, I just don't want to do that.
Do you do mobile designs?
I don't. Yeah, so we were like, to go back to the GSDI project, I don't design mobile flats. The reason for that is that once I get into Webflow, mobile responsiveness usually takes me like 2 to 3 hours to like fully go through a site, make everything mobile responsive, do all my checks, everything like that. And so if a client is really persistent on it, I will, but I find that in almost every case, they're not, it's not a deal breaker for them. In my mind, I am designing things that will scale efficiently. So if I'm designing something that's a 4 column, it goes to a 2 and then to a 1. If I am designing like a 6 column grid, it's a 3 and then a 2 and then a 1. And so I think the way that I design, I am thinking about how something will stack on mobile, or if it side scrolls, or how a slider functions, things like that. So I think it's just like an efficiency standpoint. I'm only one person. I'm not an agency. I don't have like a million resources to like spend a ton of time on design. I spend a lot of time on design, but I want to be spending it on the visual design and not on like production work of scaling down a design just to show someone how it's going to look, because they're going to see it in 2 weeks anyways in Webflow.
Yeah, in a couple hours after. Yeah, you're going to show them the thing, and then.
Yeah.
I saw that you had open graph images, which I was impressed that you were designing your open graph images right above your screens there. Question: when do you design the favicon? And because I personally, when I'm building my websites, I don't like seeing the little like Webflow or like the I want to see my brand there right away. So it's like I do it oddly, for as unimportant as it is. I like to do it pretty early in the process.
Oh yeah, I will not send a client a website if their favicon is not in there. Like when I send a site to a client, I want the favicon to be live, the web clip, all of the title tags, usually not the meta descriptions at that point because we're still working on content. But yeah, definitely like favicon, title tags, open graph images, if they're available, like stuff like that. So yeah, I see that little Webflow icon and I'm like, no.
Get out of here. Get out of here.
Get out of here.
Penny?
So what? Go to the question in the chat because my brain just lost the question I was going to ask. I'll be back.
What's the average? I actually saw one from, how many rounds of revisions are they capped at?
Oh, yeah. So in my contract, I have 2 rounds of revisions. I have 2 rounds of revisions in design and 2 rounds of revision in development. In practice, like I will revise something within reason, kind of indefinitely. If we get to a point where like I'm making revisions and revisions and revisions, and it's too much, like I will flag like, hey, if we exceed one more time of this, like I'm going to have to add in more time for the project. I find that honestly, like most of my clients are very, very courteous when it comes to feedback because I set expectations with them around every call that we have. We go through the work that we need to do for that week. I send them next steps on what I need. And we go forward like that. So I try to be very proactive in asking explicitly what I need from a client and setting expectations of this is our final round of revision for design before we move into development. Everything needs to be tied down here. And I find that most people are pretty good with that. And if it does become a problem, then I have to say something.
So you've got very courteous clients. I'm assuming you're mainly working with Canadian companies.
Almost all of my clients are American.
Whoa, you're finding the good ones. That's good.
Yeah.
Penny, did your
question come back? No.
It didn't come back.
I had it, and then it went away again.
That's all good. You can be.
We can rapid fire through. I think what's one feature you find missing in Webflow?
Oh man, they always ask me this, and I don't know, because you work within the the limitations that you have, and so I think oftentimes I'm not like, oh, I would really like that. I'm working within like what's available.
Or then you're doing it, and then you get to a spot where you've got this one site that needs to have this like unique nested thing, and then they're like, oh, I can't do that, and then you go to the forums and you're like, yeah, +1 to that. And then that becomes the one thing that you really wanted to have.
I think I was like just building something recently. Like nested collections is always the one that gets me, like having categories within a blog title. Like that's the one that always gets me is nested collections. I don't think it's like that big of a deal. Now I just like don't design like that. Whenever it comes up in development and it's an issue, it's because I'm building someone else's file where they've included it. And I'm like, oh, no, that's not possible. We can't do that. Which is usually fine, but yeah, I think my favorite new feature that they've released recently is the freelancer guest feature. I have like a list of like 20 client workspaces that I'm in, and I love it. I never have to log out anymore, which is great.
How does that work? I was going to ask about that actually, because you raved about it in the presentation briefly too.
Yeah. So the way that it used to work is that I would ask my client to create a Webflow account, and then I would ask them to share credentials with me so that I could duplicate the site in my account, transfer them the site, log into their account, accept the transfer, set up the hosting, etc. So I would be constantly having to like log in and out in order to like finish their setup, because like I'm not going to ask a client to like go in and change things like once I've transferred them the site. Like I want to be able to do that for them.
Okay, this is the danger zone, and I want you to proceed carefully. I'm going to have you walk through and try to tiptoe through the danger zone.
Yeah. So the guest role has been amazing because essentially I can ask my clients to create a Webflow account, and I'll send them a video on how to add me as a agency guest role, which is free for them. So previously, like you also had to have a workspace plan that had a seat for a team member in order to invite me to your workspace. Because they've introduced this freelancer guest role, I pay for an agency plan. Like I'm already paying them a ton of money. So my client can invite me to their workspace for free, and I can now have access to their workspace without having to log in and out. I just like go to my workspace and I select GSDI, and then I can go into their site. And it's really, really helpful.
Oh, do they mix all? Do you get one view of everything that's been shared with you?
It's like a drop-down menu. So it's like a drop-down, and you can select like Grace's workspace or Jeff's workspace or Kyle's workspace, and then you can like go into different client workspaces.
Yeah, because I think I've got a personal and then a corporate or whatever. So like I switch between the two. So that's the same concept.
Yeah, same exact concept. Yeah.
And is that like something that's just available in the freelancer tier of subscription?
I think it is. I think it's both, because there's 3 levels. There's the free, and then I think there's freelancer, and then I think there's agency. There's like one in the middle. And I think you get the access for the top 2 tiers, just not the free one. But I'm on an agency plan anyway, so I get the access.
What made you choose the agency plan over the freelancer plan?
I don't want to delete my sites. So when I build a client site, I duplicate it before I transfer it to a client, and then I keep the copy for safekeeping in case anything ever happens to their site, or like an SEO team goes in and look at it, then I can go back and like reference the original build. Or if I'm building another site in the future and I forget how I did this thing in that particular build, I can go back and reference it. And so that's really helpful. And I also feel safe in that, like, if anything ever happens to their site, I have a copy, it's fine. So I don't want to delete those copies. And also I have a lot of clones from like other projects that I like constantly reference. And I don't really want to delete them either. I think it's like only like 20 sites that you get on the mid-level plan, which just like isn't enough. I have like 40 sites just in my client duplicates, so like I don't want to get rid of.
Penny, are we?
Right.
Is it time?
Yes, I actually remember it now. I wrote it down. So it's about. So you said that you meet with them on a weekly basis, but is that just through the design phase, or does that happen through development as well? And then when you finish the site, or the basic site development to show them, do you just send it to them and let them poke around, or do you walk them through it?
Yeah, so what might be more helpful is if I explain my like general preferred working structure as a whole. So my preferred working structure with clients is that we have a weekly sync. It's usually 45 minutes to an hour at the same time every week. And that's kind of our foundation. Around that is where all of the communication really happens. So I set up a Slack channel for my clients and I to communicate in. This is like my preferred structure. Some clients don't want to be in Slack, and that's fine. Preferred structure, we have a Slack channel where we're communicating about the website. The day before our weekly sync, I will send over a 10 to 15 minute Loom overview and like comprehensive message of the week's deliverables. So the day before our sync, they get a message, they watch a 10 to 15 minute Loom video. It goes over like the new designs or the sitemap or like edits that we have. And so they have everything that they need from a presentation perspective to come to our weekly sync and just have a conversation. I don't really like using weekly sync time to present things because it's like, I think a lot of people, like they can digest that content on their own. So like my preferred structure is like, we are not presenting anything in our weekly sync. We are watching it the day before, if you have 15 minutes. And then in our sync, we're just talking about initial feedback, thoughts, things like that. That works really well for me with most like tech forward clients or clients who work in like more, I don't know how to describe that. Like they're just more tech savvy, like they work in SaaS companies or they are a marketing director, etc. I find that that doesn't necessarily work well with clients who aren't on a computer all day every day. Like I'm working with a client right now who like their business is not digital. And so it's really difficult for them. It's not difficult, but it's just like not their preferred structure to sit down the day before our meeting and watch a video and be a Slack channel. And so that project in particular, I am doing presentations every week. We have a weekly call, it's fine. But yeah, I think that's like generally my preferred working structure. And I try to be really upfront with clients about that in our intro call and ask them if that would work for them. And if they're like stoked on that, then I'm stoked on that. And if they're not, then that also kind of like factors into their project decision as well. Like I want them to be fully educated on how I work, what works best, so that they can determine whether it's a fit for them or not.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
What makes you successful? Like what are you actually like? Not what are you actually good at? I say actually, and I mean that it's like like what do you think is your trait that has gotten you to where you are? Is it the desire to connect? Is it that you are very thorough and like I'm curious what you think makes you successful.
Interesting. Well, those are flattering things that you pointed out in general, so those are great. But I think that there's a few things that can make any freelancer successful, and I think a lot of really successful freelancers like aren't the most talented people. Like I'm not the most amazing designer in the world. I'm not the most talented at Webflow. I don't know how to do complicated custom code things. But what I do I think really well is I over communicate, and I try to communicate with clarity and with honesty and with a frequency that is probably more often than most people even need. And so I think that being really easy to work with, communicating in a really clear way, setting really clear expectations for a client, all of those things that have nothing to do with design are what makes you someone that people want to work with. If you respond to messages, if you set up weekly times to meet and you send an agenda ahead of time, if like you're doing all of the admin and kind of project management things behind the scenes that make you just like easy to work with. Like, I don't want my clients to ever think like, oh gosh, Grace was like, she's a good designer, but like she never answered our messages, because that's what'll stick with them. And if you deliver a design that's like maybe not as good as the most talented person on earth, but you explained it really well and you delivered it on time and you built it well and you showed them why it worked and how Google scored it and what the SEMrush audit site said and all of those things that aren't the work, they are the things around the work. I think that's what makes a really excellent freelancer.
So you'll go and check to kind of for your edification to say, oh, yep, the lighthouse that turned out okay, and this page insights and whatnot, and you'll actually record that so that you can deliver that to the client and let them. You're almost. I mean, to what you're saying with this communication, you're almost exposing a lot of things that I think some people just don't do at all. Like I've checked my clients' sites speed, on the speed, and I've done audits and all this stuff. But then I generally come back and go, yeah, everything looked good, didn't see anything, and I don't highlight it. And it's almost what you're. I don't know if you actually I don't know if that was just an example that you were giving or if you actually do it, but it's like, oh wow, showing them like, hey, I went through and did all these things. It's like the the 50-point inspection that they do on your car. When they show you the 50 points, you go through, you're like, wow, they really looked at my car, instead of just being like, hey, your car looks good.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that it's I think in general, how I approach selling myself and selling my services is really not like a sales approach. It's more so education and just really trying to over explain everything that I'm doing and why I'm doing it and how long it's going to take and what's included and what's going to happen next and what happens before, and just really like bringing clarity to it all. And I think that particularly with those post-launch audits, it's kind of a confirmation, because especially if someone's working with an independent freelancer, like there's nobody else here. It's just me. And so like they're putting a lot of trust in me to say, hey, Grace, we told you to build a great site and we hope that you did. And so I feel like it's a little bit, once I deliver a site, just confirmation that, hey, like I actually did what I said I was going to do. This site is performative. The accessibility score is good. The SEO score is good. All of our things are set up properly. Like all of our metadata is set up properly. And so it's really just confirmation for them that like, I did my job, and you can be proud of your website and you can have confidence to know that it was done properly.
That's fantastic. So you've showed us all these like amazing assets of like timelines, and then the PDF that had the clickable links that show you how to do and use this tool. Did you just organically build those over time, or was that something that you sat down and you're like, no, I'm going to define my process, I'm going to create all the delivers, I'm going to do? Was it how did? Well, and I'm guessing it's some of both, but
secondary question on top of that: are you using any project management tools alongside kind of gathering things in the spaces
Notion,
you're comfortable with?
Big Notion fan here. She might have to come back and do our Notion talk that we're trying to do, Rachel.
Oh, amazing. I'd love to see that. So the first question around the documentation that I have and how I developed that. A lot of it was developed over time. The web guide that I send to people is based on a free Webflow clonable that someone published like 8 years ago. That I basically it's all of the same content. I just repurpose it and I put my clients' screenshots in there, and it takes me like 20 minutes per client to go in, take screenshots of the editor, replace all their names, their links, and everything else. And so that template is something that I have had for a really long time. It's currently in InDesign. It's due to be put into Figma, but I haven't gotten there yet. My proposal template is something that I developed very early on in freelancing. When I worked at the studio that I was at previously, I had like no insight or visibility into their proposal process or pricing or anything. And so when I went freelance, it was kind of like, figure it out. And so that proposal template had kind of evolved over time. It includes a letter, it includes a project overview, has like a bunch of pages that I had kind of developed over time. That was also previously in InDesign. At the end of last year, December, my work was quite slow. So I did like a freelance recap and put together a bunch of stats. And I redid my proposal template and put it into Figma. And so those things have kind of just like evolved when I've had time to do them. And that like, it's generally the same structure. A second kind of point to that also ties into the project management piece is that I had been using Asana forever for my project management to lay out all of my task deadlines, things like that. At the kind of start of this year in February, I started working with a studio manager part-time to help support on like admin stuff, so proposals and my project management tools and make suggestions on things like that. So she took a look at my proposal template and made some suggestions on like ordering and structure and another page that I should add and things like that. So that was kind of the second iteration of my proposal template. And then also we played around with a couple different tools for project management and like a CRM and stuff like that. And eventually we landed in Notion, which is where I am now, which I love. And so she set me up on, I think she built it from scratch, like a Notion database that is a calendar view of all of my tasks, a studio pipeline where I have a form on my website that if someone fills it out, it goes through a Zap to my Notion. And then I can move them through this pipeline of like lead to call booked to et cetera, et cetera. And that has been so wonderful. And I stopped working with the studio manager at the end of April, just for like cost reasons. But she does like focus days. So I might hire her for one of those in the future. She's like phenomenal. Maybe I'll just pop her link in the chat, 'cause she's just like truly amazing and I want to work with her again. But yeah, I think like getting someone to help me with that stuff and like having just like another set of eyes on it was like amazing.
Do you, after a site is launched, do you get people saying like, why aren't I ranking higher? Or like, how do I convert? I thought we were going to get more. Are they wanting more? And these are different things that, you know, and I understand this is like a design and development, whereas one is very much marketing focused. But I think a lot of people often get those things intermixed. And do you educate? I'm assuming you communicate and educate your clients around how this isn't going to just get them at the top 10 of all search results. But I'm curious if you ever have clients that want that, or are they asking those questions, or they're...
Yeah, so I think one of the first questions that I ask in an intro call with a client is, where does the site fit within your marketing funnel? And that usually tells me whether or not the site is a top of funnel like asset that people are coming directly to the site and then they're filling in forms or converting or booking calls or whatever, or if it's a validation tool. And I find that those are kind of like the two like main categories of what a website can be, is it's the main source of leads, or it's a validation tool. Someone has found out about you somewhere else and they're coming to your website to confirm that yes, you are who you say you are. And so I find for the validation sites, those less so are people generally like have questions about or concerns about, because like it's doing its job, it's telling them about their business. Great. For sites that are more top of funnel, I find that generally like most sites that I'm doing that with, they are led by a marketing person. And so they're oftentimes informed by that marketing director or marketing person's strategy and advice. And so they're leading on that. It's less so my responsibility. But if someone is interested in like, hey, like why, like, can you do blog posts for us? Or like, we need to add more content to our site. Like, do you do that? And I have people that I can recommend for like SEO and SEM work and kind of like monthly marketing strategy pieces, but I don't do that on my own.
Mm-hmm. You get people who want to move from validation to lead gen, or they go in with a validation website thinking that they're going to get a lead gen, and it's just, and have you ever helped people move that way, or are people, I'm setting up questions and then I don't actually have a tidy question to finish it with, but I think you're getting my gist.
Yeah, I can think of a client right now actually that they are a startup who I built their kind of like second version of their website. And when we had initially built it, their first site was like a DIY site. And so we did like very similar to GSEI. They had a logo and a color palette. We built out a full site design and like visual kind of system for them. And so at the time it was like very much a validation tool, but because of the way that the site is structured, they have amazing organic search results because of like the listings on their site. They're just like very searchable. People are looking at people who are like listed on the site. And so they've kind of like organically had a lot of growth just based on like how we set up the site with semantic HTML and schema markup and everything else. And so now I actually don't
schema too.
Yes, although it's like horrible and I hate it. But it's important, so I'll do it. But I have an email in my inbox from them right now actually to adjust their pricing form because they are getting more inquiries and they want to be able to adjust that flow from something that like was previously just a validation tool to something that is more of a lead capture and is more robust. So I'm like kind of going through that right now with a client, but I don't know that I have like a ton of examples of that happening.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a checklist? I mean, you've listed schema and all your ARIA tags and all the, like, do you have a, before you do it, do you have your own checklist that you go through to make sure everything is, you dotted your I's and crossed your T's?
I don't have a like set checklist that I do, but if I'm still feeling self-conscious about a website, I will Google other people's checklists and I'll go through their checklists. So if I like am feeling like, oh, like, is this site really ready to go? Then I'll go through someone else's checklist to make sure that it is.
I generally see those lists and then I'm like, oh man, that's a lot of stuff. You gotta, like, some of them are so thorough and I'm like, I can't go through and do all this.
Yeah, I think like, unless a client has specifically asked for schema, that's not something they do on like every site, but for like more robust marketing sites for like SaaS companies and stuff like that, like schema is really important for them. For their blog posts and organic reach. So like, that's not something that I always do, especially if like they don't have a blog or like whatever. But if they have a really robust resource library, like schema is really important.
We have another couple of questions in the chat. I did want to maybe circle back to what appears to be the controversial topic of SEO studios. Or generally just bring up to everybody. Okay, so we've had two people say that the SEO input has been detrimental to site health or site structure or anything. And is this a universal experience? And what is it that they do that causes so many issues?
Yeah, I think that SEO is something that a lot of people think, or I think like they don't need much experience to get into. And SEO is incredibly complicated, like search engine optimization, search engine marketing. There's so much to know with those pieces and all of the details that go into them and how articles are pulled and even just generating content and all of that. And so I've had like amazing experiences with clients who have worked with an SEO agency that knew Webflow's capabilities, were so on top of everything, and they did an amazing job. And I never had any issues with them. They fully understood what my role was. They knew how well built the site was, and we had a really great relationship. I think what happens with some SEO agencies is that they'll get access to a site and they'll not have had experience with Webflow before. So one of two things happens. The first is that they see that the site is built on Webflow and they think, oh gosh, I don't know what that is, or that's not what I'm comfortable working in. And they'll recommend to their client that they move their site to WordPress because that's what they know how to work in. And so that can ruin all of the work that you've just put in because someone else has said, oh, this is bad for SEO, and it's not. Building in Webflow, if you're building something properly and you fully understand the capabilities, you can build incredibly performative sites that have amazing SEO, but you need to know what those capabilities are. So the first one that happens is someone comes in and they say, hey, you should move your site to WordPress, which we don't like that. Second thing that happens is they don't admit that they don't have experience with Webflow, so they jump into Webflow without understanding the implications of changing classes and changing styling and getting into the designer. And so what they should have been doing in the editor in a safe environment is then happening in the designer, and that's where dangerous things happen with classes changing across the site and things getting broken and stuff like that. So I find that when things go wrong, it's usually one of those two scenarios of someone just not admitting or not fully understanding that they don't have the capability required in order to fully build in Webflow, or they just don't even want to deal with it at all. But when you do find someone who understands Webflow, knows how powerful it is, and understands the value of a designer who knows Webflow, magic, amazing.
Rachel, the other thing they'll do is they'll come in and it'll just take that engineering site that Grace showed us. It'll just say engineering.
Yeah.
They pack a lot of words, and so it can be it. And oftentimes there's stuff. Not oftentimes, they used to stuff words, but anyway.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that can happen.
If we don't have, the questions are kind of slowing down here a little bit. Grace, want to be cognizant of your time because we only signed you up until I don't know what time. You're 8 o'clock right now.
Yeah, we're going on a long time here, but I'm having a good time, and I'm happy to answer any other questions anybody has. But if we want to wrap it up, that's fine too, and I can give people resources of where they can reach me if they have other questions.
Yeah. Do you want to pitch anything? I don't know if you have anything you're working on that you want to pitch, or if you're. And it doesn't have to be stuff you're working on. There might be a local dog shelter that you want to pitch. I don't know.
Are you making any courses for people?
Thanks for that prompt, Penny. So I am currently developing a course that will be released with Dive later this summer. It's called Fast Forward Freelance, and it will go over everything that I wish I knew in my first year of freelancing, mostly from an admin perspective, not necessarily a web design specific perspective, but that's something that is in very early stages of development. I'm on the Dive website. It's been announced. It's out there. I have to do it. But it will probably be coming out in August or September later this year.
Dive website? What's the URL?
Oh, yeah. I'll send it in the chat here. Dive.club. Here, I'll send it over here.
Should I know about Dive Club?
It's pretty cool. So Dive was created by Michael Rittering, who has a course called Figma Academy, and he works at a platform called Maven, and Dive is built on Maven, but Dive is a school on Maven anyways. They basically have a collection of really phenomenal designers who have put together courses and run them in cohorts. So Joey Banks is running a Figma course. Femke is running a product strategy for designers course. Bonnie Kate Wolf ran an icon design course. There's very specific things in here that are really, really cool. So if you are curious about anything, I've heard so many good things about Steph's course and Bonnie Kate's course, and Femke had a bunch of really positive things said about her course as well. So
all design.
That
It's all design focused.
It's all design focused. Yes, it's leveling up as a mid to senior level designer is where all of their courses are focused.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's pretty killer.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Patty was wondering if they could reach out and connect on LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. The better place to connect with me is on Twitter. I'm more active there, but I will answer your message, whether it is on LinkedIn or on Twitter, or if you fill out my website form and email me. If you mention that you were in this little chat, I will definitely respond. So please reach out. happy to answer any other questions. Yeah, if you have any questions that I haven't answered here, or you don't want to ask publicly, questions about freelancing or design or any of that, I'm always happy to share more. So if I can be helpful to anyone, please let me know.
Last one for the night then. I've got you at Figma, Webflow, Markup, your Google Suite, Notion, Slack, Loom. What am I missing? Zapier, you said?
Sometimes Zapier. I reluctantly use QuickBooks.
Okay.
It is what it is. I think that's pretty much it. And I do a lot of email. But email is not like a fancy app, so it's fine. I don't use a fancy app for my email basically, so it's fine.
That's a good lineup though.
Yeah. And if you think of any extras, I want to know about it. If you think of any extras over the next few days, I want to know about it. The secret sauce to the tech stack.
Loom is my MVP out of all of those. I think like Loom and Notion are my two that I just like absolutely love. I mean, like obviously Webflow, but like productivity tools, Loom and Notion are my
you mentioned WhaleSync, but I don't know if you use that.
No, I don't. I know what it does, and I know that I don't want to do what it does.
Oh yeah, because you don't build those sites.
No, I don't do like complicated web app stuff.
But
I know that it exists. I know enough to know of what can do the thing, but I just don't want to do it.
We had Matthew from WhaleSync, one of the WhaleSync founders, on last year at some point, and I've started using it. And when the timing is right and you like need it,
I'll message you.
It's magic.
You can tell me all about it.
Oh my god. Anyway, awesome. Thank you everyone for coming. This was a fantastic turnout. Hopefully it was still as valuable. I'm sure it was. I got a lot out of this. So Grace, brava. Thank you for coming and joining us. Rachel, any last thoughts?
No, just warm, friendly thoughts to the whole crowd. Excited to have you here. We do host these every 4 to 6 weeks. We have a Webflow Minneapolis LinkedIn group that if you like or join, you'll get the notifications through for future meetings. And as we mentioned, we do post all the recordings on our YouTube channel, which you can also find via my profile or via the other LinkedIn profile as well. And I'll post that link in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at it. But yeah, we make sure that we have all of this up as well for the people in Europe who can't make it, because they're always really sad. They always complain to me that it's the middle of the night and they can't see it. But yeah, so we have it ready for if you can't make it any week.
Awesome. Yeah, and thank you again so much for having me. I really appreciated it, and I hope that it was clear and helpful, and I really am excited to tune in for more Webflow Minneapolis meetups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoop, whoop. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll see you later. Everyone have a good night.
Thanks.
See you later.